Continuing along the lines of life and its origin, the main thing is, I said before, is oxygen. Most of the living species that we know of now require oxygen. And as we said, the prebiotic atmosphere would have been probably different. And we have lots of geochemical evidences to show that oxygen, in fact, didn't reach the current levels until about a couple of billion years ago. And right now, you also have ozone in the stratosphere. We haven't looked at the atmospheric structure yet, which we will look at later on. So the lower part of the atmosphere where we live, up to about 10-12 kilometers, is called the troposphere, where the temperature decreases and pressure decreases as we go up. And you have a tropopause at which the temperature gradient changes sign and becomes positive, because there oxygen is being bombarded by ultraviolet radiation and combining with oxygen atom to form ozone, which actually prevents most of the UV from coming down to the surface, which actually is good because ozone is bad for almost all living beings. So early Earth had little free oxygen, which also means it would have had no ozone layer, so the vertical structure would have been quite different as well, because it's the formation of ozone that gives you a reversed increasing temperature gradient in the stratosphere compared to the troposphere, where the temperature is decreasing from the surface to the tropopause, as we will see later. So the lack of ozone, however, may have helped originate life, because the high energy UV probably did some magical chemical reactions which allowed life to evolve. Obviously, these are guessworks to some extent, scientific hypotheses that have to be tested. And talking about testing, Stanley Miller in the 1950s, URI's graduate student, actually did a very ingenious experiment where he took chemical apparatus and bombarded with ultraviolet radiation to simulate the early Earth on a mixture of water, carbon dioxide, hydrogen, methane, ammonia, which should correspond to the structure of early Earth's atmosphere. And you can see this nice contraption here. Carbon dioxide, methane, and ammonia and hydrogen are being added to the mix, and there is ocean water that is absorbing, that is being heated by the bombardment of the UV that is being introduced here. And in the atmosphere that is simulated, you are taking this ocean water and mixing or bombarding with the UV energy. And after a few weeks, in fact, he found that there was kind of a glue that was formed in the flask that was containing amino acids and such, which are organic molecules, not life, just the amino acids and so on, which are the organic molecules that we consider are essential for formation of life. Of course, now we have some evidence that such organic matter may be also floating around in deep space. But to go from those organic molecules to actually assemble RNA and DNA is a long step that we don't know yet. But nonetheless, Stanley Miller never won the Nobel Prize, but it was a very similar experiment which at least made a step towards explaining that the early Earth's atmosphere and UV bombardment could have led to the first steps of the evolution of life. Then Darwin came along. During the voyages, actually, we didn't mention Darwin. Happened in the 1800s, where he spent several years on the ocean. He was not a very happy person on a ship. He got seasick a lot. So he was very happy when the ship got stranded on the Galapagos, where he had many of his epiphanies about evolution. Beak of the finches is one of the famous stories that came out of his discoveries. And so the best theory we have for evolution and natural selection is, of course, the Darwinian evolution theory. Organisms adapt and change through time. Advantageous traits are naturally selected. Traits are passed to the next generation. So it is this replication process that appears to be critical for defining life, going from organic molecules to what is life. Life not only evolves, but also it replicates itself, reproduces itself. Of course, there are now debates about whether a virus is a life form or not. By all definitions, virus doesn't qualify as life, but nonetheless, it is using a host body like us to replicate, like COVID is doing right now, for examples. So the environment makes a selection as well. So organisms adapt to environments, and organisms can actually also modify the environment. So if you think about photosynthesis, for example, plants, the vascular plants only evolved about 400 million years ago, and large-scale photosynthesis would have taken down carbon dioxide and increased oxygen in the atmosphere. So the current atmosphere was actively modulated by organisms. Of course, the extreme end of this organisms modifying the environment is the so-called Gaia hypothesis, where it is proposed by James Lovelock that the environment was actually actively regulated by life to suit itself. We don't have very good evidence for this, but nonetheless, that's one of the theories that is around. Plants and animals evolved along the way. The geologic time scale evolved. So heterotrophs would have been the earliest life forms as far as we know, because if you look at the cellular structure now of eukaryotes, or the cells which have a nucleus inside, mitochondrion, which is responsible for respiration and producing energy, actually seems to carry its own DNA, which means it was probably assimilated by another organism, saying this will be good to have because it can produce energy for me by respiration. So plastids, which drive photosynthesis by taking sun's energy and combining with water and CO2 to produce carbohydrate, also have their own DNA. So earliest life in that sense would have been a separate mitochondrion, which is producing energy by respiration before photosynthesis became abundant. So they would have required external food supply, which probably came through chemosynthesis, because there was yet no photosynthesis. So they were deriving energy from breaking the bonds of chemicals, or making chemicals out of other molecules and so on. So autotrophs evolved later, and they started to manufacture their own food supply, and this is confirmed by various evidences we can find. That's kind of the brief introduction to life, and we will not learn much more than that, but we'll come to oceanic primary production and other things in later modules.